take this cap off, use a 22mm socket. Take it off by hand so you don't strip out these little caps. And slide it off. Take the lug nuts off, use the same 22mm socket. Take the wheel off. Disconnect this wheel speed sensor wire. You can use some needle nose pliers or a screwdriver. Just pop that off there. And over here, get underneath here. And then it's kind of hard to see, but behind this shield, you have another retainer. And you want to disconnect the connector. You're going to have to feel around for it. There's a little tab. Pull up on the tab, slide the connector out. There's another retainer that's holding it down. Try to get underneath it with a trim tool. And pop it out. Now I'm going to remove this bolt, use a 10mm socket. This is for the brake hose bracket. Now grab that bracket, you should be able to slide it up. Now I'm going to take out the brake caliper bracket bolts. I'm going to take the caliper and the bracket off all as one with the brake pads. Use a 21mm socket. Now grab the caliper, use a brake caliper hanger, and find a place to hang the caliper over here. Just going to hang it from the bracket for the hose, brake hose, and that seems like it's working fine. There's no tension on the hose. Now slide the brake rotor off. Now I'm going to take some side cutters and take this cotter pin out. Bend it back. And try to grab it from the other side. This is a little bit rusty, so I'm just going to use a little rust penetrant. And use an 18mm socket and loosen this bolt up. We're not going to take it off completely. And just leave a few threads on there. When you get to the end, just make sure there's a few threads on there. So that's good. There's many different tools that you can use to separate the ball joint from the knuckle. You could use a pickle fork. The only problem, if you use a pickle fork, you're probably going to ruin the upper ball joint bolt. And if you're not replacing the upper ball joint, you probably don't want to do that. There is other types that will push on the lower part of the ball joint, and you can do that. Or carefully take a hammer and just give it a tap right there, and you should be able to separate it. There we go, separated. Before we take the knuckle off, I want to separate the outer tie rod end and then also loosen up the lower ball joint. Remove this cotter pin, just use some side cutters. Oops. Now take a 22mm socket, remove this nut. There's also other front end tools you can use to separate the outer tie rod from the knuckle. The pickle fork, you're probably going to ruin the boot though. And then other types that push down on the nut. Or carefully, just use a hammer and give it a tap. And if you were replacing the outer tie rod, you could hammer right there, but you don't want to do that because you could mushroom it over a little bit. we go, that's separated. Now I take the cotter pin off here, use the same side cutters, and just bend it. And pull it out. Now I'm going to remove this nut, use a 22mm socket. And now I'm going to separate the lower ball joint from the knuckle. I am going to use the pickle fork. Again, if you are trying to save the boot, you probably don't want to do this method. There is other tools. Now that that's separated, just to make this removal process easier, I'm just going to take the nut and put it back on a couple threads. Now I'm going to pry down with the pry bar on the upper control arm. Then I can remove this nut and let that go. And just move the knuckle away from the ball joint, from the upper. Now supporting the knuckle. Then take this lower nut off and slide the knuckle down. Now we need to remove this bolt. This is the adjuster bolt for the torsion bar key. When you're removing this bolt, you can either count the turns, make a chalk line on your socket, count the turns, and when you put it back together, put it as close as it was when you took it out, or just make sure when you're done this job, you're going to have to adjust the ride height with this adjuster. So use an 18mm socket, take this out, just like that. To take the key off, you're going to need a special tool like this. This is going to compress it. There's a little nub on the top, a little slot, and then you have to slide this part of the tool into the slot. As you tighten this up, you should be able to get this plate out. And it's actually pretty easy, just like that. I didn't even have to use too much to tighten this. Now I'm going to use a punch, or you can use an air chisel, and just try to hammer the torsion bar forward. Ideally, you want to remove this torsion bar key. You should be able to push the torsion bar forward and the key drop down. This one's frozen in there pretty good, so I'm going to let it soak for a while. But in the meantime, we're just going to take off the control arm with it in. There is a good amount of slop in here, which should be to our advantage, which is good. Take off the sway bar link. I'm going to use a 14mm wrench underneath and a 14mm socket on top. Take that nut off. Now I'm just going to put the nut on temporarily and just use a hammer and just hammer down the center. Try to slide that out. And just pry the bushings up. And just slide that apart. Use a 21mm wrench and 21mm socket. Take this bolt out. Slide that. Because the lower control arm is going to swing down when I loosen up the other two bushing bolts, I'm just going to take the bolt for the lower shock and just put it in just temporarily. Now I'm going to loosen up those other bolts. Now I'm going to use an 18mm socket on this side of the bolt, and then a 15/16 or a 24mm socket on the nut. And take that off. Before I slide that bolt out, I am going to do the same on the front one. Now I can take this shock bolt out, and this can swing down a little bit. Now support the lower control arm and take this bolt out. that out of the front and take the back bolt out. And slide the control arm down and just slide it off. Now with the new control arm, this has to slide on the same position it was when it came off. So if this twisted at all, you're gonna have to twist that back. And then slide this in position. You can try and use a pry bar, try to pry it into position, and then grab your bolt. There you go, get that one lined up. And get the front bolt in also. Get that all lined up. And put the nuts on. There may have been a washer. If you find a washer, put that on first. And then the nut. And the same on the back one. Before we tighten those nuts and bolts up, what I'm going to do is support the lower control arm and get it as close to ride height as possible. I'm not going to hook the shock up yet. And then once it's close to ride height, then we can tighten those down. Ideal, you would be putting this all back together with the vehicle on the ground and then torquing those bolts down, but that's not realistic. It's extremely hard to do that. That's about ride height. Now I'm going to snug these up first. Now I'm going to torque these to 129 foot-pounds. Now I can lower the pull jack, set that aside, and get the shock bolt through. Put the nut on and tighten this down. Make sure it's good and snug. If you were able to slide the key out, you want to slide the torsion bar back in and slide the key back in position. And then take this tool, line it up on top. If you have the key and it didn't seem like it's lined up in this position, like it's down one notch, you're going to have to make those adjustments, whether you took the front lower control arm off the way we did, or whether you have the key on wrong and adjust it so it looks like this. Now take this piece and slide it in position. Then you can loosen up on the tool. And remove the tool. Take the bolt, get the bolt started. Now either count the turns going back in or put it as close as you can to where it was and make adjustments when the vehicle's on the ground. Sometimes you can tell where the rust ring was, roughly where it was in position. That looks good. Now get this upper control arm roughly at ride height when you took it off. And just tighten the nut up. And torque this to 140 foot-pounds. Then do the same on the other side. Take the grease fitting, get that lined up, and get it started. And take a 7mm wrench or socket and just snug it down. Take that sway bar link and just put it back in position. that lined up. If you're struggling to get the link in, you can either slide it in the opposite way, going down, or you can loosen up the other side. That might help you move the bar a little bit. So just get that pretty much upside down and then put the nut on. And I did support the lower control arm just to raise it up a little bit, make it a little bit easier. And now just use your wrench and tighten these down. And take a grease gun and just give it a couple pumps of grease. That's good. Now grab the knuckle and line it up with the lower ball joint. It's a good idea to keep the nut in your hand while you get that started. Now we can line the upper ball joint up. And just use a pry bar. Pry down on the upper control arm. And get that nut started. Now I'm going to torque this nut to 81 foot-pounds. And look for where the cotter pin's going to go. If the hole doesn't line up, then just tighten it up a little bit more so that the cast silver nut lines up with the hole. And put the cotter pin through. Take the side cutters and just bend it and trim the excess. Now we'll tighten up the upper ball joint nut. And if the stud starts spinning, you can support the lower control arm and use a pry bar and pry down on the upper control arm. And torque this to 37 foot-pounds. And if the cotter pin doesn't line up, the hole doesn't line up, tighten it up a little bit more. Now slide the cotter pin through. And just use the side cutters and bend it. And just trim the excess. Now line the tie rod end up with the knuckle. And put the nut on. And tighten this down to 44 foot-pounds. And again, if the castle nut doesn't line up with the hole, then you can tighten it up a little bit more. And slide the cotter pin through and bend it with the side cutters. Now put the rotor on. I'm just going to put a lug nut on the rotor just to hold it from flopping around. Now take the caliper off the hanger. And making sure the hose isn't twisted, slide the caliper back over the rotor. Make sure the pads are separated. Take the caliper bolts. You can put some thread lock adhesive on these bolts. There we go. And torque these bolts to 221 foot-pounds. And line this bracket up, take the bolt, get that started, and tighten this down. And just snug it down. Now take the wheel speed sensor harness and line that up. Push that, lock it down in the bracket. Take this push pin right here, line that up. And the other push pin, you can't really see it behind there. And then you're going to connect the connector up there as well. And lock it down. Now take the nut off, the lug nut. And the lug nuts. Now I'm going to torque these lug nuts to 140 foot-pounds in a cross pattern to tighten the wheel down evenly. Now I'm just going to go around again, double check. Take the cover, line it up, and just by hand, just tighten these down, just snug, not too tight. After you're done the job, keep in mind you should bring the vehicle to a local shop and have it aligned. You don't want to have premature tire wear.